topic today is to cover ways that you might reduce the tillage in your garden, things that you can do to try to get your tillage down. So the objective is, first of all, tonight I want to talk about tillage operations, or what do we consider to be tillage, and then compare that conventional and reduced tillage, and then investigate some no-till or reduced till options that are available to us as home gardeners. The broadest definition is the preparation of soil by various types of mechanical agitation. We have conventional tillage, which would be like raking and harrowing. That's a conventional tillage operation used to break up clods and to kind of rough up that surface a little bit, but not deep tillage. It's pretty shallow, maybe 3 or 4 inches down typically, unless you put some weight on those harrows. Then it might be a little bit deeper, but that's one of those under this definition of mechanical agitation, right? Spading, it's back in the days before they had tillers, you'd take out your spade or your fork out there and you'd turn your soil. And so that's a tillage operation. What about rototilling? I mean, that's the one we all look at, when we think about tillage, go out there and get that machine out there and till down and stir up that soil and break up the clods and get it fine and whatnot. And so that's rototilling. Is weeding a tillage operation? Well, by this definition, it would be. Mechanical agitation, the physical weeding, actually even pulling the weeds would, I guess, be considered a type of tillage under this very broad definition. And planting itself is a tillage operation. Again, mechanical agitation of that soil for a purpose. But plowing, of course, that's our most one of those, that along with rototilling and whatnot, disking and plowing. And then deep ripping, the farmers, if they've got some hard pan developing down, a compaction layer down in their soil down more than 12 inches, they'll do a deep rip, 12, 20, 24 to 30 inches deep. They'll get these big tines and rip that soil down deep to break up that hard pan. That's definitely another tillage operation. So when we talk about reduced tillage, could we consider raking and harrowing we've got all these tillage operations. I didn't even put disking on there, but these tillage operations over here on the left. So when I think of reduced tillage, I think of not turning the deeper soil up to the top. We might disturb things a little bit at the top of the soil, but we're not digging down deep. So plowing and deep ripping, although deep ripping doesn't really pull it up to the top, but it does dig down deep. And then rototilling and spading, actually, I would consider the spading to be a fairly harsh or deep tillage. You're not beating the soil to pieces, but it's a deep tillage. So let's look at what I threw up here on this list. Tilting is a newer term. At least I haven't heard it until just within the last couple of 3 years. But tilting is when you take it's kind of a light tiller, and you only just kind of disturb the top inch or two of the soil to just kind of give you a good, maybe seed to soil contact when you're planting and things like that. Or maybe you put down an inch or two of compost and you just kind of want to work that into the soil just a little bit. You don't want to give it down deep. You just want to get it so it's got good contact with the soil. So when you get it wet, the microorganisms can get in there and pull that down and work it down into the soil better. So just so that you know what it is, tilting. It's just a very light 1, maybe 2 inches, and that's it. You're not getting down very deep at all. So that's kind of a reduced tillage. Now weeding, generally speaking, you get the hoe out there. You're not going to be digging down deep and pulling that up there. And so weeding could be considered a reduced tillage as opposed to disking or using a tiller or something like that. Planting, again, we've got to get this, unless you just want to throw the seed on top of the surface of the soil and let it maybe survive. Maybe it will germinate, maybe it won't germinate. You can do that, but you're not going to have good success with trying to do it that way. So planting, you're not turning things up. You're just trying to get to the point where you can put the seed in there and get it covered and get good seed to soil contact so that your seeds can germinate. So you look at those again, conventional tillage, And originally I was going to say, well, this is no-till. This is going to be a no-till talk. But when we look back at this definition of tillage, almost everything we do is some sort of tillage. Now, there are some things that we can do that actually are no-till type options. But, everything, if we want to get a garden going, if we want to plant transplants, if we want to direct seed into our garden, that is a type of tillage. Now, there are some things that we don't necessarily need to do mechanical weeding, but if we don't have a way of keeping those weeds down, we will end up with reduced yields in our crops. So we want to do something. So I changed it from no-till gardening to reduced till or minimum till type gardening practices. So let's look at, while we're kind of talking about this conventional tillage, let's look at some advantages. There are some advantages to conventional tillage. Reed and I, we think about farmers and the conventional tillage that they do, and that's kind of where this comes from. But we look at some of the advantages, though. If we've got pretty cloddy, or if we just have mulch on the surface, it's important for us to have some type of tillage for us to get that seed into the soil and get that soil up around that seed, touching that seed, the moisture from the soil, so we get good seed germination. An advantage, it does introduce more oxygen into the soil. So that could be considered an advantage, but because the roots need to have oxygen. And if you've got a really heavy clay soil or a compacted soil, then tillage may be necessary to get that broken up so we can get good oxygen movement down there for the seeds. So that's an advantage. So it kind of depends on what your soil is doing at the time. You use tillage to incorporate fertilizers and pesticides. A lot of times, some of these fertilizers that we put on and pesticides that, if you're going to use pesticides, they need to be incorporated. Some of them do, especially when we're talking about weeds, but maybe even some disease pesticides. Typically for home gardening, we don't typically recommend a whole lot of disease type pesticides, but the fertilizers, we put the fertilizers on. If we put those on, some of those are such a nature that if they are allowed to be exposed to the environment for very long, especially nitrogen, can volatilize and go up into the air, and we don't get any benefit of it down in the soil. And so it's okay to work that down into the soil a little bit so we don't lose some of that fertilizer if we're going to put that down. Put organic amendments or crop residue and things like that to work those down into the soil. It will allow you to get that out so you get good soil contact so the microbes can work on it and kind of use that food from the organic matter for their growth and development. Improve that initial permeability. If you've got a crusty soil, for example, tillage can break that soil up so that we can get water permeating down into the soil and infiltrate that soil a little bit better. If you've got hard pans and things like that, it can, and a hard pan being a layer down lower that's compacted and water won't move through, you can improve that impermeability of the water through the soil with tillage to a certain level. You may have your hard pan down deep enough that your equipment won't reach that far as well. So that's another thing to think about in there. We do reduce the immediate weed pressure, so tillage will kill those, especially the seedlings and annual weeds. Tillage will kill those, and hopefully you've done it before they've gone to seed, because then you're just, tilling back the seeds back into the soil. But anyway, that's you will reduce that immediate weed pressure, break up the hard pan. I've talked about that in relation to the permeability. And then some crops, especially root crops, potatoes, garlic, they are grown in the soil. You plant them deep into the soil, and so there's a certain amount of tillage just to get them planted and then harvested. Even harvesting, I guess, could be considered, those crops can be considered a type of tillage. You don't have to really stir things up really heavy, but you have to dig them out of the ground. And so that's a tillage. So these are some of the advantages of conventional tillage, some of the benefits we get from doing it. And that's why, especially on the large farms, it's just a lot easier to use tillage on a large scale to get this done. Because if you think about how we do it in gardens on a small scale, it's a lot harder to do what we do in gardens out on the farm. And in order for them to be successful and to make a profit, they've got to have some of these conventional tillage practices to help them make that soil work. But there are some problems that come with conventional tillage as well. Let's kind of talk about that. So the seed bed should be firm. So what you do is we disc up the ground to take out the weeds and get things all ready. And then right behind the disc, we have a cultipacker to firm that soil back down. So we're fluffing it up and then firming it back down, because you want that seed bed to be firm. You don't want a soft, fluffy seed bed. It'll dry out too fast and be hard for your seed to stay viable or to germinate and do well. And so you plant them into a firm seed bed, firm enough that you can step on it, and you might leave a footprint, but it doesn't sink a half inch down into the soil. You want to just maybe an eighth of an inch to a quarter of an inch is the maximum of compaction you want when you step on it. I guess is what I'm saying here is we're kind of fluffing it up and packing it down at the same time. So that increased oxygen that we introduce into the soil actually burns the organic matter faster. So when we do the tillage to introduce or to incorporate the organic matter into the soil, we're actually incorporating the oxygen into the soil as well. And that makes it so we have to add a lot more organic matter. And that's why it's really hard where we have our conventional tillage. It's really hard to get our percent organic matter in our soils up above 2% in southern Idaho, especially. Northern Idaho, you got a lot more rainfall, and so that helps. But down here in southern Idaho, we've got low rainfall, and so we incorporate the organic matter and the oxygen in there, and we irrigate, and then that tends to burn it back up again. And so this tillage increases that oxygen and it burns that up faster. So we have to add more. One of the things we're beginning to learn better, and the young plants need to establish a symbiotic relationship with the soil microbes. And if we have beat those soil microbes and the soil structure and all that kind of stuff, and we beat those to pieces, and then we plant these young plants in there, it takes longer for them to establish a relationship with these microbes in the soil. And so excessive or a great amount of conventional tillage can slow that process down. We do get higher erosion with conventional tillage. Crop residue, you're not leaving that on there, protecting that soil surface. We lose permeability, infiltration. And notice I said, well, we get improved permeability and with the deep ripping and things like that. Yes, we do. But when we till and we break up that soil structure, we leave the soil particles on the surface. And when they get wet, they form a crust. And that slows down our infiltration, and the permeability can also get reduced until that structure gets rebuilt. And so if we destroy the soil structure, we lose that permeability infiltration until that can rebuild itself. And it takes the microorganisms time to do that. And this is right along the same lines. We break up that soil structure. The structure helps to improve water movement through the soil. It helps to improve air movement through the soil. And so we can get better gas exchange, better water exchange if we had good soil structure. And you think about what we do with our rototillers, we are just beating that soil structure to pieces. And if we keep doing that year after year after year, it gets harder and harder for that soil structure to get reestablished. The weed seeds, we talked about conventional tillage can knock down that initial growth, that the weeds that are there that are going to cause problems. But at the same time, when we do this tillage, especially this deep tillage, we're pulling weed seeds from the seed bank that's in the soil. They're there. We're pulling them up to the surface, so we get a lot more weed seed germination after tillage, as opposed to not tilling. We're not pulling anything up, and we kill anything that's on the surface, and we're not pulling anything up. And so tillage has a tendency to actually increase the later weed pressure, not the initial weed pressure when we got the seeds germinating. And that's the most critical time, when seeds are germinating. And hopefully they'll get up faster than the weeds will. A lot of times what happens, you get the garden all tilled out and smooth and ready to go, and you get in there, and then weather like today, snowy weather we just having right now, you can't get out there, And so the weeds actually will start germinating before we can get our crops to germinate. And so that's one of those things that we have to fight with. And now the weeds are going to cause that pressure. And so if you don't till and bring those weed seeds up and you kill those weed seeds that are germinating at the top and don't bring any more seeds up, then you're going to have less weed pressure. And not only does it break up the soil structure, but it breaks up that biology. It makes it harder. And the more we till, the weaker the soil biology becomes. Okay. And then tillage, you lose soil moisture. So, right now the soil is plenty wet. At least the soil it's been exposed all winter long. We've had a good wet winter, and that's good. We till it. First of all, we don't want to till while it's wet. We want to make sure it dries out at least a little bit if we're going to do some tillage. We don't want to be creating clods, these slick, hard, compacted clods, which is not the same as soil structure. But when we till it up, that soil dries out a lot faster. And so we have to be a little bit more careful with our germinating seeds. We do get compaction by equipment, even with our rototillers or standing on the ground when we're doing this tillage and things like that. We will get some compaction. So, be aware of that with this heavier conventional tillage stuff. So now minimum tillage or reduced tillages, what are some of the advantages of minimum tillage? And when I say minimum tillage, it could be you're going to till the garden, but you're not going to till the garden every year. Maybe you kind of break it up and say, okay, this year I'm going to till this 1/3 of the garden, and next year I'm going to till this 1/3 of the garden, and the next year I'm going to till this to get some of those advantages, but we're not doing it year after year after year. And when we leave the organic matter on top as opposed to tilling it in, that organic matter will get incorporated into the soil eventually. It's a slower process. It's a natural process. You've got the bugs, the shredder bugs that come in and they'll tear that organic matter apart using some of that carbon for their benefit. Then those particles get down on there. The worms will come up, and if it's moist enough, they'll come up and they'll take a bite of that organic matter, go down and do their worm castings. And so there is a process, a natural process for pulling that organic matter down into the soil, but it's a slower process. And there are some advantages and disadvantages to that, but you do get the organic matter will get down there, just not a fast like we do with the tillage. The soil biology is maintained, not only just the structure, but the biology itself. We've got the microorganisms there that are not having to reestablish their colonies and all that kind of stuff, get strengthened. And when we talk about this also, there's good biology and some bad biology in the soil. But if we allow these good biology to stay established and do their job, that reduces the bad biology that's in the soil, the disease, fungal diseases and things like that. So if we've got good, healthy soil, the good biology in the soil will help to reduce all the damage we get from diseases and other things like that. Plants establish a relationship with the microbes quicker. The plant roots need to establish that symbiotic relationship. And the earlier they can do that, when that microorganisms in the soil are healthy and strong and they're not worried about that, they can establish that relationship quicker. They start getting fed by the carbons, the excess carbons that the plant's producing. It produces enough to grow plus some, right? And so the excess carbons are coming down to the roots, and they're feeding that soil biology with the excess carbons. So, we used to think, okay, carbons, we want organic matter in the soil, and so we're going to put carbons onto the soil in the form of our organic matter, and that's the organic matter that's coming there. And that's partly true, but the plants themselves have excess carbons that they exude through their roots to feed these microorganisms. And so if we can keep that healthy relationship going, get it established quicker, it's going to be much better for the plants and better for the soil biology as well. We can reduce our reliance on synthetic fertilizers. If we provide all the nutrients that the plant needs with synthetic fertilizers, we create lazy biology in the soil. They're not going to get the carbon that they need from the plants, and so they're not going to provide the nutrients that the plants need. And those microorganisms in the soil, that's what makes those nutrients available for the plants and make those mineral compounds in a form that the plants can utilize. So we don't have to put as much synthetic fertilizers and maybe not very much at all, depending on the health of your soil and things like that. And that's, you have to, it's a fine-tooth comb there that you have to kind of work through that to make sure that your plants are growing well. The soil is protected from erosion. With this minimum tillage, we're leaving a shield or a cover on top of the soil so that when rain hits it, we don't get this rain impact, the splashing the soil and get real erosion or wind erosion on the soil. It breaks that up so that we don't lose our topsoil, and that we're working really hard to establish topsoil. Let's keep that topsoil there, right? Less reliance on pesticides. Now, I know that some of these minimum till or reduced till in the farming world on a large scale end up applying more pesticides. Now, it's kind of a two-edged sword. We've got a smaller carbon footprint, if that's one thing that you're concerned about. You got a smaller carbon footprint, but at the same time, you've got to get that weed pressure under control. And so a lot of times they'll use more pesticides, or especially herbicides, to reduce the weed pressure. So with minimum tillage, sometimes we actually rely more on pesticides than less. But at the garden level, we can do it less. In the farm level, it's not as easy to do it less. We're storing more carbon in the soils when we do it this way. Less of it's getting burned out and released as a carbon dioxide into the gas. And so if you're concerned about greenhouse gases, then having more carbon in the soil is better for that. You're trapping and storing more of that carbon in the soil because we're not tilling it up and introducing that oxygen and burning that carbon out and releasing the gases in the atmosphere. So we get better carbon storage in the soils. And one thing I think we really need to think about, kind of get our minds around this concept of feeding the soil rather than feeding the plants. And if we feed the soil, a healthy soil will feed the plants. Now, you may not get maximum yields, but you can get optimum yields, which means for the inputs that you're getting into, you're getting a good yield from your soil. Now, if you want to get maximum yields, if you want to have the most tomatoes or the most potatoes or the biggest potatoes or the most corn or whatever, then yeah, you're probably gonna have to rely on synthetic fertilizers and have this mindset of conventional farming. But if we can kind of step back from that and say, okay, let's look at being optimum here. What can we do to get the most that we can out of our soils, but not reduce them to a whimpering soil biology thing? Okay, so let's think about feeding the soil through the plants. It's the carbon we're feeding these microorganisms. It's the carbon. That's their energy source. They need nitrogen for their body composition, things like that. So they will use up nitrogen, but their energy source is the carbon. And so it's either going to be through the organic matter we put onto the soil or through the carbon exudates coming from the plant roots. And then, if we're not tilling up this soil every year, when we take the top of the crop off, we leave the crown, the roots of the plants in the soil, we allow them to decay naturally. That creates channels for water to get down deeper into that root zone and that microorganism and the organic matter to kind of be pulled up and down better through these root channels. And so we get better infiltration and permeability of the water if we leave those roots in instead of tilling them out. And then we've just ruined all that channeling. The same thing with the fungus and all that kind of stuff that's in the soil that we need. Now, there are some concerns with minimum tillage, and so this initial weed pressure can be high. Compaction may be an issue, and so if you've got a compaction problem to begin with, then you may need to till to break up that compaction, or at the very least, plant some crops that have the ability to push through a compacted layer and create a little more aeration down deep. So, the dicone radish and things like that can be used to push down and open up channels down. And so you break up that compaction. So if you have compaction issues, you need to address that because that creates shallow roots. And then you have other issues you have to deal with. It may be difficult to get seeds started. So if you've got a shield over the top of that, you've still got to get this good seed to soil contact. And so sometimes the tools that we have in home gardening are not the best at getting that seed through that shield into the soil. And so we don't get good seed to soil contact. So that's one of the things to think about to get that seed to soil contact. The soil, if you've got a cover over the top of it, it's going to be a little slower warming up in the springtime. And so if that's a concern for you, you may want to pull, leave it covered for most of the winter, and then a couple of weeks before you plant, pull that organic matter off to let that soil warm back up, plant your seeds, and then you can put the cover back on where your seeds aren't, so the seeds can come up through and not be hindered by your organic matter cover. With minimum tillage, if you're going to use fertilizers and amendments, then you may not get them incorporated very deeply. You can still incorporate them, again, depending what you call tillage. If you're going to be a purist, I don't think you can garden. Fertilizers and amendments are not necessarily incorporated with this reduced or minimum tillage options here. So let's talk about here reduced tillage practices for home gardeners. Sometimes you'll hear a stale bed preparation. So what a stale bed preparation is, and we talked about weeds coming up, you get your bed all prepared, you maybe do a little bit of tilthing or whatever it is you're going to do, you get the bed prepared, you haven't planted it yet, but you can't get onto it right away. And so what some of these truck gardens and things like that will do is they'll get that bed prepared for planting, make sure it's got moisture in it, and then cover it. They'll cover it with black plastic. The stale bed preparation, the black plastic is actually probably a better option. So that's what a stale bed is you've got the bed prepared, and then you allow the seeds to germinate. You have a way of killing those seeds without further tillage. You take off whatever it is. Once you've got those killed, then you plant your crop. Now, there's some growers that use this technique called deep mulch growing. And essentially what that is they will, instead of growing in the native soil, they'll put down a cardboard layer, and then they'll pile good compost, not really mulch, compost, using good compost, 10 to 12 inches, and they'll grow right into that compost. Now, after that first year, if you've got moisture going down, that cardboard will eventually disintegrate. In order for this to work, they've got to keep putting down a couple of inches of compost every year, because that compost will be broken down, and it's got to be good compost. It's got to be well composted. It can't be, kind of mostly composted, because then we'll start getting the nitrogen sink, and they'll tie up that nitrogen in there. So it's got to be well composted. Now, this one's actually looks like it's actually soil that's been piled up. Same kind of concept, though. For this to work well, I think you got to be in a fairly high water situation. So, I mean, if you're going to be sprinkling your garden like the rainstorms back east or something like that, then it might work okay here. A lot of these guys that do this, they do it in a wide bed, so 30 to 40 inches wide, and they've got this raised bed. They'll put wood chips for the walkways in between to reduce compaction in between those beds. So that's that deep mulch concept. If you've got a good source of reliable compost, then that's something to look at. And those guys that do it, they don't till it, and it's soft. You can plant right into, you can pull the plants right out. It's not like the mineral components in there, because it's mostly organic matter that we're growing in. There's this concept or technique called back to Eden, and kind of what happened was they had these arboretums, and they'd keep all the leaves and everything cleaned out underneath the tree, so it was nice, pristine area, and they found the trees were struggling. And so they allowed those things, the leaves, and maybe even chip up the branches and put those down, the wood chips down on there. The tree roots were healthier doing that. And so this back to Eden technique is kind of based on that concept. You've covered the ground with a wood chip mulch. You don't till it in, you just put it on top of the soil surface, just like it'd be out in the forest, right? Back to Eden. And then you open up down to the native soil, you open up where you're going to be planting your plants, your transplants or your seeds or whatever the case may be, and you plant those right there. So you have this in between the rows. And when that's done, you take the crop out, you just cover it back over again. Okay, so that's the back to Eden technique. And then there's the one that's called a row mulch technique. And this is actually my potatoes last year in here. And what I did, potatoes are grown in the soil, but I didn't want to till them down into the soil. And so I put them right on top of the soil and then covered them with this wood chip. And so that's all there is. That's just wood chips. And during the summer, when I wanted to go get some potatoes, I just pull the wood chips out, pull off a potato or two or three or whatever I wanted. We'd go cook some potatoes. I'd cover back up. The plant's still living and producing all summer long. As soon as they started producing tubers, I could go out and harvest and have potatoes to eat. And so I really actually like doing it that way. I haven't tilled it. I just put those potatoes. Actually, I did make a little furrow so I could kind of set them down into a little trough and planted them there. Now, when it came time for harvesting, all I did was I pulled off those wood chips away from those rows and picked the potatoes up off the ground. Some of them the tubers had kind of gone down into the soil, but they weren't covered by more than a quarter to half inch of soil. So I just kind of raked my fingers over that, pull those tubers up. And then those chips I used for my next step, and that is to produce garlic in the same system. So I just took this picture just a couple days ago. That's the garlic that's growing up through the mulch. Now, garlic, when we plant that in the fall, typically we want to plant those 3 or 4 inches deep in the soil. And so we've got that deep planted. We had to make the furrow deep. And then when it comes time to dig them up, we got to go down and dig them and loosen them up from the soil so we can pull them up out. We don't have to dig a lot. But when you think about harvesting of potatoes and garlic, especially in a commercial way, you are really disturbing the soil. And so the whole concept here, and I will be frank on this one. This is my first year doing this way with garlic. And so we'll see how well the bulbs form for the garlic. Because I get good bulbs forming planted down in the soil. Now, if it gets to where they don't form real well, then maybe I'll have to rethink this particular. But I kind of thought, well, this might be a good concept here to do it like I did with the potatoes, because it worked so well with the potatoes, it might work with the garlic as well. So that's a way of not tilling some of these crops. You can't do that with carrots and beets and things like that. But some of these crops that we have traditionally been planting deep and harvesting deep, maybe it's a way to reduce that tillage. Of course, there's always these weed barriers and synthetic mulches, and I would caution you to not cover, especially in your garden. But I would never again. I have done it. I would never again put these synthetic weed barriers underneath the mulch layer. I don't care if it's rocks or if it's wood chips or whatever. I will not use these underneath the barrier and leave it there for years, because eventually the weeds will land on top. They're designed to keep the tops from growing up through. Well, it doesn't work for quackgrass. Even this higher quality woven weed barrier, the quackgrass will still penetrate through that. And so it's great. I use these in crops that are hard to weed, especially the squashes. The squashes and melons, the vines are growing out and they spread out. It's really hard to weed in that area. And so that's what I use this for. This is my crop. This is my squash and pumpkin patch and melons. So those are a good tool to use. But some things that are essential for this is you've got to have water and air be able to go through this. And so plastic does not work. Don't use plastic. You got to have good air movement through there. The one problem with this, though, even if the water will seep through, but when you get a rainstorm, it doesn't all just kind of seep through it. It flows to a low spot. And so we get areas of higher water concentration than not. Drip irrigation works really well under here. Sprinklers, not quite as good, but you can still do it. But I like to put drip irrigation right underneath here. I've got 2 drip lines going down each one of those rows on those squash plants. And then flame weeding. I like to do flame weeding in certain situations. And so if you have a stale bed preparation, and what some people will do is they'll get the stale bed and they'll kill those weeds off, and then they'll plant their crop. And then a couple of days before the crop is ready to germinate, they'll kind of have a place where they'll plant them early or something, so they can tell when they're ready to start popping up out of the ground, right? couple days before the seedlings of the crop germinate, they'll go back over that with this weed burner, like that one on the right, and they'll burn off any weeds that have popped up in the meantime, and that gets that crop a good head start before. Now, of course, this one's showing them burning in between the rows, and as long as the crop's not real big, that's fine. You can do that. The guy on the left is just a stale bed preparation, the way he's doing that. But anyway, so that's flame weeding. I do use that, especially in non-crop areas when I don't. I have there's a roadway that goes back to my garden, and it's just kind of a weed patch if I don't do something about it. And so I use the flame weeder a lot on those and some of these early spring weeds that I can't get to with herbicides if I plan to use herbicides. And then finally, this other one, this mulched pathways. I kind of mentioned this with that deep mulch gardening technique. This is actually in one of my high tunnels where I moved the soil from where I'm going to have my walking way. And so now I've got deeper topsoil. I basically doubled my topsoil because I pulled the topsoil off from that pathway. And then I put wood chips in there to walk on, so I don't compact the soil as I'm walking in there if it's wet. Of course, it doesn't get very wet in a high tunnel, but sometimes you'll get the drip line will be leaking out anyway. So I don't create any compaction doing that. And then the soil biology needs to have bacteria, especially bacteria. And I mean, bacteria is a big thing. Lots and lots of bacteria and a lot of fungi in your soil. Well, fungi works on this higher lignin type products, the wood chips and things like that. The bacteria really loves compost, something that's been composted. It'll go to town on the compost. And so you've got to have kind of both of those there. And if we don't, so this wood walkway kind of provides a little bit of fungal, and sometimes I'll see the fungus growing right along the edge of the wood. And so we get some root establishment, and they're pulling out from the wood chips. And so these mulch pathways, doing it that way, again, I'm planning on these being permanent beds. And so each one of my 17.5-foot paddocks will have 4 beds. These are 30-inch beds. And then I got 16-inch walkways between, actually 21 inches on the outside, so I can walk down the outside of the high tunnel. And that gives me a good functional, actually 8 rows in my high tunnel, at least 2 rows, and sometimes 3 or 4 rows in each one of those wide beds. So that's another one of those things that I am doing.